Fray Diego de Landa throws into the flames, one after the other, the books of the Mayas. The Inquisitor curses Satan, and the fire crackles and devours. Around the incinerator, heretics howl with their heads down. Hung by the feet, flayed with whips, Indians are doused with boiling wax as the fire flares up and the books snap, as if complaining. Tonight, 8 centuries of Mayan literature turn to ashes.
Over the past 500 years, Mayans and many other people have had various forms of intervention in their communities by people claiming to know what is best for them. Whether they have been missionaries, politicians, Peace Corps workers, anthropologists, relief agencies, or even human rights organizations. All of them, in some form or another, have gone to these countries with the position that they were going to help these people, show them how it is done, or make their lives better, or to simply save them from themselves. This story is about my conversion, about how the Mayans became my teachers. This is a story about learning solidarity on Mayan time.
Vivo en un país libre, cual solamente pueda ser libre. En esta tierra, en este instante, soy feliz porque soy gigante. Amo una mujer clara que amo y me ama sin pedir nada, o casi nada, que no es lo mismo pero es igual. Y si esto fuera poco, tengo mis cantos que poco a poco habitando al tiempo. Como le cuadra a un hombre despierto. Soy feliz, soy un hombre feliz y quiero que me perdonen por este día los muertos de mi felicidad. Soy feliz, soy un hombre feliz y quiero que me perdonen por este día los muertos de mi felicidad.
So Jeff, why Guatemala? What got you interested in Guatemala and Central America?
Well, it was the early 80s, and Central America was in the headlines just about every day. And in many ways, it was the obsession of the Reagan administration at the time. And I first got involved in Central America when I was a student at Aquinas, and then just continued that work when some of us started the household here at Koinonia. And I remember we were doing all kinds of things, like demonstrations, and we used to have weekly vigils in front of the federal building, letter writing campaigns, all that kind of stuff. But it seemed like at some point we really felt like we needed to take a bigger risk, to take another step. And so we became involved in what was known at the time as the sanctuary movement. So this movement was based upon people offering shelter or safe haven to folks who were fleeing U.S.-sponsored state terrorism in places like Central America, and particularly El Salvador and Guatemala. And it also was sort of based upon this idea that we were going to sort of publicly defy the administration's policy, which was saying that these people were nothing more than economic refugees. And what we were saying is that they were political refugees. And it was even dubbed as the new Underground Railroad in many ways. So in 1987, we became a sanctuary, and the first families came in the spring of 1987, and we had 9 Kanghobao-speaking Mayans from the northwestern part of Guatemala. So Spanish was their second language. And we began working with them initially in our house, and then we obtained another house that they moved into. And within about a year, I knew at that point that I had to myself go to Guatemala to see firsthand what it is that they were experiencing, so that I had a better understanding with the work we were doing with them. So in the fall of 1988, I went to Guatemala with an organization called Peace Brigades International, which did nonviolent accompaniment work with people who were receiving death threats from either the government or from paramilitary groups in the organization. And I spent several months there in 1988.
In this way, we, the descendants, have known our history. This is our genealogy, which will not be lost, because we know our origins, and we will not forget our ancestors.
October 23, Santa Cruz de Quiché. It's late evening and I'm exhausted. Not from the physical exertion, but from listening to the words of Maria. We had invited some of the women from Conavigua to have dinner with us, and two of the women came. One brought her daughter. Maria, one of the leaders of Conavigua, spoke eloquently and passionately to us for about 2 hours. She told us that there are some 3,000 widows because of political violence in the area of Quiché alone. Maria talked emphatically about their suffering, explaining that it was the history of their people. First, she spoke about the struggle with the church, its silence, and their historical justification for the plight of the people. Wait for justice in heaven, they were told. She also said that they have suffered because of language barriers. First, because the Mass was in Latin and then in Spanish, making it virtually impossible for people to understand what was going on. She said, if you don't speak Spanish, you are nobody here. And she continued by saying that the Protestant Church has come with their own complicity and urgings to wait for peace in the next life. The other area of great suffering has been at the hands of the military and the civil patrols. The violence is blamed on the guerrillas, of course, but everyone knows that this is just propaganda. Maria says, the military tells us there's peace, but where is the peace? In addition to the crimes we suffer at their hands, we also suffer the constant threat that they will come and take our sons from us to serve in the military, or take our daughters to rape. The other woman, Angelina, spoke only on occasion to enforce a point made by Maria, but she spoke constantly with her face. Her eyes spoke of pain and rage and cried out throughout the evening. She told us that she lost one of her children from hunger. After this night, I will never be the same. Their words and faces are forever imprinted on my mind. November 22nd, Santa Cruz de Quiché. We all listened to profound, heartfelt feelings about life during the 80s. Bodies everywhere, heads hanging from the wires in the streets. And it is because of this that after dark people do not leave the streets and say very little about El Ejército. Amilcar talked about the propaganda of the military with the civil patrols. He says that they showed films that indoctrinate members of the civil patrols as part of the counterinsurgency campaign. These are animated films that depict human rights workers as the wolf and people as chickens and the government as the mother hen. The military also sent out a group of young troops or trainees, and these men talk to the women of the village to try to win over their trust. Then the women get their children together to play games and receive candies from the soldiers. And once they've gotten some trust, they ask things like, when does Dad leave for meetings? Or does he have any Ladino friends that he talks about? And I wondered if these techniques were taught to their superiors at the U.S. Army School of the Americas. November 24, Guatemala City. I had just arrived at the house of a family in a barrio just outside the capital. The family asked for our presence because a few days ago the father was kidnapped in the presence of his oldest son. And while waiting for a bus, a car with tinted windows pulled up, grabbed the father, and drove off. Fearing that the father is dead and that the boy got a good look at his kidnappers, the mother invited us to stay at her house round the clock in case they came back for the boy. The son, who saw what I should never have to see, is extremely talented. He gave me a pulsera that he made himself just 30 minutes after I arrived that had my name engraved in it. This makes any gesture of hospitality I've ever engaged in seem quite pitiful. After dinner, they gave me the honor of chopping some wood to help heat the stove. Mom makes tortillas to sell as a way of making some money to buy beans and other staples. And at the end of the day, she profits about 2 quetzales for the family.
Before, they killed us in the name of progress and anti-communism. Now they kill us in the name of democracy.
October 25th, I'm in the village of Los Cimientos. As we neared the village, we were greeted by a group of children who had run out to welcome us. All of them shook our hands and then ran ahead to alert other villages. Several men came down the path to help us carry our gear and make the last several hundred yards even more delightful. After being taken to the hut where we could unload our stuff, we were promptly taken to the main building in the village where the anniversary celebration had already begun. The ceremony was simple, with a fire in the middle, with a circle consisting of wood and candles. There was a drummer and a flute player who began their simple yet beautiful melody that played background to the invocations of a Mayan priest. He gave thanks for the year here in Los Cimientos and to the elements and all other living creatures. It was quite majestic, with incense, smoke, fire, and the overwhelming magnitude of the misty mountains that surrounded us on all sides. The informality of it all was very delightful, though, because children kept running around, even around the fire, and people talked casually during this entire ceremony. We were told later that this was a Catholic ceremony that had been preceded by a Mayan ceremony, and later that day they were even going to have a Protestant one. So the plurality and inclusiveness was profoundly evident. And after lunch, I was able to interview one of the older members of the community about its history and the difficulties of the past decade.
Yo le voy a contar la historia donde salimos el año 1982. Fue al 28 de febrero, donde salimos, no salimos por nuestra voluntad, contra la voluntad salimos. Me recuerdo de que el año 1982, el mes de enero, vinieron el ejército. Nos dijeron de que todos aquellos de que sí de verdad que están viviendo en nuestra mente, en este lugar, entonces que salga un tiempo, cuando se compone el tiempo, pueden regresar otra vez. Entonces la comunidad de los cimientos no muy creía de que sí, que estaba muy duro la situación. Pero luego cuando volvieron la segunda vez dijeron de que si no salga, todo se tiene que ser quemado las casas y tienen que ser cenizas todas. Luego la gente pensando, oyeron que así, si tuvieran que salir uno por uno, hay unos salen de las 7 de la noche, 11 de la noche, a medianoche, a las 3 de la mañana. Salieron por las montañas, se agarraron por las montañas, pero con la mano cruzada. Todos animales tienen, todos maíces, todos casas, todos ovejas, ganados, capitales, total, etcétera, etcétera. Se quedaron aquí los cimientos. Entonces la gente todo tienen que agarrar por la costa del sur, ir a trabajar en la costa, porque no tienen, se quedaron con la mano cruzada.
November 2, Santa Cruz de Quiché. At 3:30, a young man of 19 arrived at the Surge office with his family, a member of the Cook group and a witness to the young man's assault. Last night, two men from a small village in Quiché were on their way to a store when they were attacked by members of the civil patrol, so they stated. One of the men was beaten, but managed to escape, but not before they had stolen the more than 1,000 quetzales that he had earned in Guatemala City. After taking his testimony, we all went to the local government human rights office to document the accusations. Testimony was taken again, along with pictures and a signature. Next, we went to the local UN office known as Minugua for other documentation and denunciations. Amilcar and others put this act into context since Surge and other popular groups had just been to this man's village to campaign for the Frente. It is believed that people who attend the rally or are associated with these groups are accused of being part of the guerrillas. The UN officer present would not allow me to tape the presentation in the office, and then took the two men from the village into a separate room for questions. Amilcar turned to us and explained that this is quite contrary to the nature of communal approach of dealing with problems in the villages, as well as not taking into account the fear that these men may have telling their stories to strangers without anyone around whom they trust. November 11th, still in Santa Cruz de Quiché. I did not get to bed early because of all the activity and people in the courtyard, but it did give me an opportunity to mingle with folks. Earlier in the day, I went with some of the women to the marketplace to get food for all the fiscales. They had planned to make a big pot of black beans, a chicken-based soup, and tortillas. The women were very curious about the status of Guatemalans in the United States. We talked about the difficulties, especially the difficulties they face in the radically different culture. While they all certainly understood why people left the violence, most of them commented that they were glad that they stayed in their own country. Another woman who was only 19 talked about how she was involved in organizing for years. She was an extremely articulate and a very optimistic person for the future. I was impressed by her clarity and confidence.
Mi nombre es Catarina Lainez López. Yo vivo en un cantón chosiquinero, Santa Cruz de Quiché. Y yo participo en estas elecciones, estoy participando en un comité cívico, que soy parte de la corporación concejal quinto. Y yo sí me siento feliz o contenta por haber hecho este trabajo, ya que ya nos queda unos pocos horas o minutos para estas elecciones y es por eso el motivo que estamos nosotros aquí reunidas con todas las compañeras, compañeros trabajando por estar luchando, pues queremos que se cambie este problema que tenemos nosotros en este país, porque nosotros estamos sufriendo, tanto como yo participo con las señoras de viudas, como es con Avigua. Yo participo con ellas porque yo siento que el sufrimiento que han pasado con sus hijos, hijas, y es por eso que yo me siento triste con ellas, pues porque han sufrido, y es por eso que nosotros queremos un cambio, y ahora pues que queremos pues luchar más contra la violencia de los derechos humanos, participar más, y queremos llamar toda la gente, toda la población, para que seguimos adelante con el gobierno, porque sabemos que el gobierno no nos está respondiendo. Ya hemos hecho, o sea que hemos aprobado con un presidente de católico, un presidente de acción católica, de evangélico, pero nunca nos han resolviendo los problemas que nos ha pasado en este país, pues, y hemos pasado muchas discriminaciones, amenazas, asesinatos, pues, y es por eso que nosotros ya no queremos eso. Queremos que se termine estas cosas, estos problemas que se han hecho en este momento, pues. Entonces es por eso que estamos aquí ahora por las elecciones, y ojalá que seguimos adelante, y todos los compañeros que estamos en diferentes organizaciones, y solamente. Muchas gracias.
November 12th, back again at Santa Cruz de Quiché. As an election observer, it was my job to report on any of the process that was in violation of election standards, as well as to act as a deterrent to any potential fraud or violence that may occur. I was one of about 100 or so independent observers from all around the world. I worked in the Department of Quiché and observed in 5 towns throughout the day. We did observe some elements of coercion. In Patsute, members of the PAN party were giving money to people before they got into line, hoping to buy votes. In San Pedro Jocopilas, some parties were displaying party emblems, a violation of election day rules. Many people also discovered that their names did not appear on the register, even though they had a voting card with a designated number. And at the same time, there were reports that names of people had been dead for years appeared on the voting lists. And then there were reports of military personnel or civil patrol members around voting stations. But the biggest problem, however, laid with the very structural element of how the election system worked. Most of the people who came in to vote were areas that I observed in were indigenous, and many of them had never voted before in their entire life and weren't familiar with the voting process. Matters were complicated by the fact that the voting procedure was in Spanish, thus making it difficult for people who were either unable to read or only spoke an indigenous language. The election representatives at each table were almost exclusively Ladino and male. When people had problems, many of them could not communicate with those in charge. The most common thing we witnessed was people were going to the wrong place. And upon arriving, most people would simply go to the nearest voting site and wait in line, sometimes 2 or 3 hours. Frustrated, many people simply gave up and went home, never able to fulfill their hopes of voting for change. Clearly, the system was fraudulent, at least for the majority of poor indigenous people. In spite of these efforts and that of many of the popular movement, nearly 60% of the population either refused to vote or could not because of the difficulties posed by the system.
We have a very important weapon which the government does not have. That weapon is called dignity. With this weapon, no one and nothing can defeat us. They can kill us or jail us, but they will never defeat us.
December 21st in Oventique. On 2 occasions so far today, both the military and police helicopters flew overhead. The Army helicopter appeared to be a Huey, the same kind that we used in Vietnam. Both circled several times around the camp, the military helicopter much lower. It is clear that these are tactics of intimidation. One of the members of the community came to speak with us this morning about the possibility of leaving in the event of a military incursion into the camp. The urgency of things propelled us to quickly put more wooden spikes in the ground near the Aguas Calientes. During the process, more helicopters came, first the police and then the Army. Moises from DF pleaded with us to stop working since they could take pictures of us that would be used by the immigration. What a life to be constantly under surveillance, with the intent of eventual invasion and physical repression. What kind of psychological damage does this cause parents who always worry about the safety of their kids? The fear of children playing too far away, unable to reach them before the soldiers come. The confusion that must fill children's heads due to the external fear displayed on their parents' faces. The disappointment of these little ones whose space and time to play has been robbed by soldiers desperate for pay. In the cool December morning, I rise to greet the warmth of the sun. Dew drips off plants and roof, while barefooted Indians pass by on the road below. Oventique, Aguas Calientes of youth, where children walk hand in hand or lean up against siblings. Their eyes are dark as the earth, their smiles bring hope from the mountains. Zedillo calls these young Zapatistas terrorists as they prepare the New Year's festival. Pine needles are spread out like a royal carpet where musicians create ancient songs with marimba and flute. Their bodies sway in rhythm like trees that bend in the wind along the narrow path. In view of people gathered, the more beautiful than anything I've ever seen. Painted canopy or ecclesiastical ceiling, families sit proudly on benches built for this open air of democracy, while helicopters fly above monitoring games and ice cream vendors. As the night approaches, the Mayan moon illuminates the court where dancing and Tzotzil speeches fill our souls. And even though we do not understand the words, we know their truth, the way lovers know each other's touch. It is here that I understand the meaning of justice, its hunger satisfied, and like the mountains, these proud people have withstood the withering of history and the cruelty of men, walking in paths of freedom.
Tourists rarely see this side of Guatemala, the systematic dehumanization of the indigenous people. The economic system in Guatemala is based on maintaining a cheap labor supply. In order to legitimate the exploitation of the indigenous people, we are characterized as lazy, cowardly, submissive, and inferior. In this way, the criollos and rich Ladinos have for centuries organized Guatemalan society as if 5 million indigenous people did not exist. This myth helps the dominant classes believe that we are dispensable.
June 21st, Guatemala City. The labor demonstration yesterday was very interesting. Not as big a turnout as expected, but there was plenty of action. Again, the focus was on the increase of electricity and phone rates. The demonstration was organized primarily by the labor groups, but there was also a significant popular movement presence there as well. The march began at the Parque Colón and from there marched around the Parque Centenario to the official residence of the president, then to the electricity bill payment center, and finally to the Guatel. Congressman Amilcar Mendez made a speech at the presidential residency. And shortly afterwards, a young Ladino man dressed in black with a bandana covering his face and a USAC t-shirt set fire to newspapers that were strewn in front of the door. The fire went up quickly with a great deal of black smoke, which would indicate that the papers were probably soaked in kerosene. As the march proceeded towards the electricity bill payment center, a bus was stopped. The same young man began hitting the bus driver with a hammer, smashing windows. All the passengers fled when armed guards entered the bus. As it drove off, one of the soldiers shot his rifle into the air several times to prevent any further damage committed against the bus or the driver. All the while I was videotaping these events and feeling like they were from a distant newsreel, since my perspective was from that of a viewfinder. Once the march reached the payment office building, someone in the crowd began to break down the door. A representative finally came out to speak with the demonstrators, and he eventually walked out into the street when suddenly someone began to hit him, and others quickly intervened to prevent further violence, and then the crowd finally moved to the Guatel office. Along the way, several young men began smashing public phone booths that lined the streets. And it's helpful to note that whenever someone decided to take their rage out on property, the march organizers made it a point to urge participants to remain nonviolent. The next day, the newspapers focused on the violence of a few and not what caused the march to happen in the first place. So it goes with advertiser-driven journalism. June 22nd, Guatemala City. A few quick thoughts about the activities from yesterday's Day of the Disappeared event organized by the GAM group. The whole event was extremely moving, sort of an artistic smorgasbord of expressions that spoke to the pain and rage of so many of Guatemala's inhabitants. First, there was a short ceremony conducted by 2 Mayan priests. With incense and fire, they prayed for justice and they invoked the spirits of 5 centuries of their people who had suffered from violence. The outdoor area was filled with banners, a photo exhibit, which was a trademark of GAM, and a list of los desaparecidos. Perhaps the most moving aspect of the day was a short play done by 2 women and 3 men. This play was a synopsis of the years of the violence, of La Guerra, and an artistic impact of the entire 4 volumes of the Catholic Church's Historical Memory Project. And one thing I noticed about how they did theater that I had not seen much in the U.S. was the interaction between the crowd and the actors. People felt free to engage in a form of talkback, an element that gave the play a much more organic life. David felt it was important to interview the actors, both for their comments on the importance of popular theater in social change movements, and as a resource for the testimonial literature project that these interviews would contribute to.
Es una obra donde el machismo está presente y nosotros lo que hacemos es ridiculizar cómo es el machismo, pero al final de la obra siempre hacemos una reflexión para que no se críe hacia los niños, no, que los niños deben de tener una educación compartida, una educación que siempre sea para todos por igual y no que persista siempre el machismo como tradicionalmente es en nuestro país. El otro tipo de obras que hacemos es obras con contenido político de concientización y de denuncia. Denunciamos las actividades que ha hecho el ejército, las actividades que ha hecho todo el sistema tradicional de derecha en este país y siempre estamos en contra de eso y por eso es que hacemos teatro popular.
And there was one other thing about that trip that was really, we hadn't planned on it at all, but it sort of fell in our lap. Remember, we were in Famdegua's office interviewing the director, and you were doing the interviewing. So what exactly did she say that kind of clicked something for us?
I think she responded to a question you posed, which was, is there anything we can take back with us from this meeting to the United States? You know, what can we tell people there about what we've seen here? And her response, she didn't miss a beat. She said, look, we need our people to be trained as agronomists, as teachers, as scientists. You know, we don't need any more military training. You know, we've had enough of that. You know, and we know about this School of the Americas you have over there. You know, that needs to end. It's caused us enough suffering. You know. That was the gist of her response. And then it took a single organization we met with what they thought of the School of the Americas.
Las cosas importantísimas considero yo es de que tal vez somos soñadores, pero consideramos de que si Estados Unidos no da el apoyo en las escuelas que han dado apoyo a Guatemala, como la Harvard, las Américas, donde han preparado a tanto militar, sean cerradas o que no se les dé esta oportunidad a los guatemaltecos para que vayan a aprender cómo torturar, cómo asesinar, que en cambio los preparen en campos científicos, cómo hacer mejores cosechas, cómo trabajar mejor la tierra, en fin, en otros campos en la medicina, ¿no? A cambio de que se les esté enseñando a la gente cómo torturar. Considero de que es un deber moral hacia el gobierno el reconocer y qué admirable, ¿no? Que lo reconozcan, que ellos de alguna manera tienen culpa, pero esto tiene que ser ratificada con algo que valga la pena para los guatemaltecos. No solo que reconozcan el error, la parte, sino también que apoyen a la población guatemalteca.
Nosotros como asociación de estudiantes apoyaríamos cualquier medida que vaya encaminada a cerrar la Escuela de las Américas y cualquier escuela militar. principalmente por la experiencia que como guatemaltecos vivimos. Todos los jefes de Estado militares que cometieron genocidio en este país fueron educados en la Escuela de las Américas. Creemos que esas prácticas ya no deben de ser practicadas en el mundo, y sí consideramos que este tipo de escuelas militares a nivel mundial deben de ser erradicadas totalmente. Creemos de que todos le apuntalamos ahora hacia la democracia, hacia nuevas vías de tolerancia, a generar condiciones de paz, de cultura de paz, que nos puedan tener como estudiantes, como población, espacios de propuesta, de tolerancia, de poder tener injerencia incluso en la misma toma de decisiones, e ir construyendo estados más abiertos al diálogo, más abiertos a la participación ciudadana. Y en ese sentido sí creemos de que el tipo de esta enseñanza que dan esas escuelas militares van contrarias totalmente a esas medidas. Entonces nosotros, claro, apoyaríamos cualquier medida de escuela de este tipo, y las apoyamos, y es más, las felicitamos.
June 30th, we're flying somewhere over the United States. It seems strange now making our descent back to Michigan. Just a few short hours ago, we stood in the Central Plaza with thousands of other people on what is called the National Army Day. Strangely enough, in this post-war period, the military still feels the need to show its might. The plaza was filled with regular Army soldiers, palace guards, tanks, military brass, and even some of the elite killing troops known as the Kabil. Above the assembled sea of soldiers hung banners that proclaimed in eerie fashion that the Army has won and brought the peace. Fortunately, this display of deception did not go unnoticed by members of the popular movement. GAM organized a silent protest just to the right of the festivities' main stage. People gathered there with banners, lists of the disappeared, and stood there silently as a witness to the thirst for justice that still struggles to be won. Again, members of FEDIFAM joined GAM in their silent protest. So David and I took advantage of the opportunity to interview these courageous souls, particularly about the role that the School of the Americas played in what was still happening in Latin America. What better place to hear their skillful damnation of the SOA than an event that still celebrated the efficiency of repressive institutions. We spoke with representatives from Peru, Argentina, Mexico, and Colombia. The women from Argentina were both with the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. One was actually a founding member. She was a grandmother, unlike many, with the exception that she had to live with the knowledge that she will probably never know what happened to her disappeared family members. At the end of her comments, I said thank you, but before I walked away, she leaned over and gave me a kiss on the cheek. This was just yet another example of the amazing hospitality and gratitude these people had for folks who were working in solidarity.
Mi nombre es Marta Vázquez, de Padres de Plaza de Mayo, línea fundadora de Argentina. Estoy aquí también en la reunión del Comité de Dirección de FEDEFAN, representando a familiares de detenidos y desaparecidos por razones políticas. Hemos comprendido cómo venía implementado esta teoría de la seguridad nacional, este terrorismo de Estado que es en todos los países aplicado de la misma manera, los mismos métodos y las mismas directivas. Nuestros militares pasaron por las escuelas de las Américas y algunos también en creo que es el Instituto de Defensa de Estados Unidos. Muchos de ellos se han jactado en Argentina de haber pasado por allí y de la acción que ellos habían cometido en Argentina. Pero nuestra lucha es de años en denunciar y decir que no debe existir más la Escuela de las Américas. No puede ser, si queremos que nuestros países vivan en paz, no puede haber escuelas para enseñar a matar, a violar, a torturar, a detener y desaparecer a los ciudadanos.
Let the day begin, let the dawn come. Give us many good paths, clear and straight. Let the people have peace, peace in abundance, and be happy, and give us good life and a useful existence.
December 8th, Guatemala City. Late in the afternoon, we went to the Central Plaza for the Dia de Diablo event that Mario told us about. True to Guatemalan time, we were able to look at books and read in the shade while things got set up. I was sitting on the fringe and did not notice right away, but within minutes I saw a young couple who were both sniffing glue. They quickly noticed me and sent their young son over to solicit money. It was another encounter with the wounds of the neoliberal model. In many ways, it was the perfect preface to the demonstration that followed. Various sectors of the popular movement made 22 piñatas, who were images of devils representing the 22 FRG party diputados that they claimed were acting illegally. There was also a noticeably larger piñata that represented Rios Montt, who was the head of Congress at the time. In fact, all the piñatas had photos of the FRG politicians. So music, speeches, and chants made up the agenda, and then a funeral pyre was decorated with fireworks and gas-soaked hay. What impressed me most about the gathering was the insistence of the organizers that this be a fun, festive function. It seems that too often the seriousness of such activities can stifle the spirit. The other thing that was just as creative was the knowledge that we somehow need to embrace this type of attitude more when doing demonstrations in the United States. December 15th. I just came from a press conference with various representatives of the human rights community, Fundación Menchú, the Mirna Mac Foundation, FAMDEGUA, GAM, Alianza Contra Impunidad, and a whole host of others. They presented a 6-point response to the Spanish court's refusal to proceed with the legal application filed by Nobel Peace Prize winner Rigoberta Menchú against Rios Montt and various members of the army who they claim are the most responsible for the genocidal policies of the late 70s and early 80s. Afterwards, I asked both Elena Farfán with FAMDEGUA and Claudia Samoya with Fundación Menchú if they thought there was sufficient evidence to prove that Rios Montt and the others were responsible for the genocide.
Mire, tenemos dos pruebas documentales importantes, que es el REMI y los resultados de la Comisión de Esclarecimiento Histórico, pero además una serie de pruebas peritales, como por ejemplo las exhumaciones. Hay restos que comprueban que lo dicho en la Comisión de Esclarecimiento Histórico ocurrió. Por el otro lado, el genocidio se demuestra probando que hubo una voluntad que ordenó el genocidio, y dos, que esa voluntad estaba enraizada en el Estado. En este caso, que los jefes de estados y sus estados mayores más los ministerios de gobernación impulsaron dichas órdenes e incluso dieron esas órdenes. Todo esto es probable. De hecho, es lo suficientemente probable para que por primera vez una comisión de verdad dijera de Naciones Unidas que había un genocidio. Es la primera vez que eso sucede. Es el nivel y la cantidad de pruebas. Nosotros nos metemos a un caso judicial porque sabemos que tenemos las pruebas. Es importante para el pueblo guatemalteco que la verdad sea vencida en juicio o la mentira sea vencida en juicio, y esa es la razón por la cual se ha impulsado este caso, para poder ver el panorama general en lugar de masacre por masacre.
December 31st, Oventique, Chiapas. This morning was one of the more moving experiences of my life. At about 5:30 a.m., several thousand people gathered on the road in front of Oventique. Their mission was to walk to the nearest army base and tell them simply to leave, now. Many from DF and international observers were invited to participate. After the first mile or so, we were greeted by another group marching from the south. We then took a side road that wove through the mountains to the army base, and people carried signs that read, "Military leave," "Fulfill the Accords of San Andres," "Release political prisoners," "Leave already," and "Demilitarize Chiapas." The morning was cloud covered, but you could tell when the sun was rising as it gradually became even more light. One thing that was impressive was the level of order and discipline that the participants showed. We finally arrived at the military base in Jocopilas. The crowd immediately began to chant at the gate, and a few soldiers walked down carrying their rifles, and the few in the guard held their posts by the gate. Then the group decided to move past the first set of barbed wire by crawling under it, while some of them entered, others threw paper airplanes at the soldiers who stood there. This is what they jokingly called the Zapatista Air Force. People were now pressed up against the last gate, while others had panned out on both sides of the entrance, pressing up against the guard's post structure. The chanting continued with statements such as "Chiapas is not a barracks," and then catching the military and many of us off guard, the people actually forced their way onto the base. Trudging through the mud, the hundreds of supporters had backed the soldiers up against the barracks, now chanting "Oi, oi, oi," and "Zapata vive." The look of many of the young soldiers' faces was one of disbelief as villagers began telling them the pain that their presence has caused their families every day. After about 30 minutes had passed, some of what appeared to be military officers came out to speak to the crowd, and people kept demanding their immediate departure. And I overheard one of the officers tell a pleading man that they indeed were leaving today. The exchange between some of the villagers and the officers went on for some time, when all of a sudden one of the communication antennas began to fall. I was able to turn quick enough to capture it on film. The crowd cheered wildly as it hit the muddy terrain below. And later we found out that someone had cut the lines to prevent the soldiers from communicating for outside assistance. At one point, one of the villagers got the crowd to quiet down as the declaration was read out loud expressing their demands. When the reading was finished, as if on cue, the people began to sing the Zapatista anthem. But this time, more than 2 hours had passed, and people eventually began filing back to the base and back to Oventique. And as we walked back, the clouds had begun to part, and the sun warmed us as if a divine affirmation of the morning's activities was bestowed upon us.
Comunicado del Comité Clandestino Revolucionario Indígena, Comandancia General del Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, México. 1 de enero del año 2001, 7º aniversario del alzamiento zapatista. Por mi voz, habla la voz del Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional. Hermanos y hermanas indígenas mexicanos, hermanos y hermanas de México y el mundo. En el año 7 de la guerra contra el olvido, repetimos lo que somos. Somos viento nosotros, no el pecho que nos sopla. Somos palabra nosotros, no los labios que nos hablan. Somos paso nosotros, no el pie que nos anda. Somos latido nosotros, no el corazón que lo pulsa. Somos puente nosotros, no el suelo que nos une. Somos caminos nosotros, no el punto de llegada ni de partida. Somos lugar nosotros, no quien lo ocupa. No existimos nosotros, solo somos. 7 veces somos, nosotros 7 veces. Nosotros el espejo repetido, el reflejo nosotros. La mano que apenas abre la ventana nosotros, el tímido llamado a la puerta del mañana. Hermanos y hermanas, 7 han sido los reflejos que el antiguo espejo ha sacado del segundo 1000 y el 20º que terminan.
In 2005, I went back to Guatemala, months before the U.S. government voted on the Central America Free Trade Agreement. Most Guatemalans knew about this trade agreement because of the amazing popular education being done by dozens of organizations throughout the country. CAFTA will have devastating effects on the environment, the region's poor, and indigenous communities. The popular movements in Guatemala and Chiapas are also organizing against another economic policy called Plan Puebla Panama, a neoliberal project that could turn the region into one large sweatshop zone. As these economic and human rights violations occur, the U.S. continues to use the war on drugs and terrorism as justifications for continued military activity, with maneuvers being held in the region of San Marcos, Guatemala, as recently as January of 2007. 2007 also marks the 13th year of the Zapatista struggle in the war against forgetting. I am forever indebted to the lessons learned in El Mundo Maya. But the most important lesson I learned was from the women of Conavigua. One night during dinner, one of the women said to me that they were very grateful for us as international solidarity workers. But then she went on to tell me something that I can never forget. She said, "It's important that you're here, but more important that you return to your country to tell the people what is going on here, because the way you live determines how we live. Your lifestyle and your government's policies have a tremendous impact on our struggle." Those are the words that are forever in the back of my mind, reminding me that every day, solidarity demands that we must continue to do the work that respects the lives of people around the world, especially those that are demanding justice.
This war is always a matter of the corn patch versus the World Bank, the hoe against the stock market, the poorly armed guerrilla band against a military armed to the teeth by the Pentagon, the village against the WTO, the smallest against the Fortune 500, the local against the global, the many against the few. There is a clear choice to be made.
Aprendimos a quererte desde la histórica altura, donde el sol de su bravura le puso cerco a la muerte. Aquí se queda la clara, la entrañable transparencia de tu querida presencia, comandante Che Guevara. Y fuerte desde la historia dispara, cuando todo Santa Clara se despierta para verte. Aquí se queda la clara, la entrañable transparencia de tu querida presencia, Che Guevara. Aquí se queda